This lecture is about microevolution, and in particular, one mechanism of microevolution called natural selection. We oftentimes associate this theory of natural selection with Charles Darwin because he was one of the first two to really publish significant papers about these concepts, and another man named Wallace did also. I want to tell you just a couple of quick things about Charles Darwin because it's important to talk about his observations and what they meant in the development of the theory of natural selection. So Charles Darwin was raised in a pretty religious family. His father was a doctor. And when he went to college, he studied theology. He also studied medicine. And he was very interested in the natural world. So he studied geology and really had a life-changing opportunity in 1831 to join a boat that was surveying the coast of South America. Now, keep in mind, at the time, people didn't just travel the world and collect biological specimens and take notes. So this was a pretty new thing to do. And he did just that. He traveled for several years on this boat, and he took really great detailed notes and collected a lot of specimens and made a lot of really important observations. This picture that's being shown right above his name is a picture of Darwin's finches, and you can see a lot of variation in the beaks of these finches. And he observed that based on the shape of their beak, you could determine the diet of these birds. In other words, they were very specialized to their environment. Their beak shape matched their food, whether they ate fruit or insects or seeds, and what size of insects and seeds that they ate was reflected in the size and shape of their beak. So these specializations to their environment were one of the really important observations that Charles Darwin made. This picture above shows another observation that Charles Darwin made. And I'm going to just list a few of these key observations because they're really important to realize when you talk about the theory of natural selection. First thing that Charles Darwin noted in all of his travels is that offspring oftentimes resemble their parents. And this sounds obvious to us, but again, if you're living in times when people don't really write these sorts of things down as observations, this was really important to note. And remember, we didn't have DNA analysis at that time or even know what the mechanism of heredity was, but he just was one of the first to really note that offspring resembled their parents. And there must be some mechanism by which parents were passing on traits to their offspring. He also noted something that you probably noticed when you saw all these different colors of these mussels, and that is within a population of organisms, there is variation. So there is variation among individuals within a population. Not everyone looks the same. Not everyone has the same traits, even if they're in the same population. Remember, a population is a really important unit of study in evolution because that's the level at which evolution occurs. We talked about this a little bit in one of the earlier lectures, but I'm going to really stress that today. First, important to redefine a population. Population is a group of organisms of the same species. Oh my goodness. I'm not sure how I did that. So a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So they're interbreeding with each other, they're competing for resources, they're being affected by the same environmental conditions. So this is an incredibly important unit of study in evolutionary biology. I'm gonna try to get rid of this ruler. Sorry, I'm clearly not a graphics expert here. Like, I might as well just be writing on paper and projecting it some other way. I don't know how I always hit something with my hand and do this. I really apologize for that distraction. So offspring resembled their parents. Again, didn't really understand the mechanism for heredity there, but also noted that there was variation among individuals in a population. One other key thing that he noted is in many populations of organisms, more offspring are born than can survive. So he really started pondering, why is it that certain individuals survive and reproduce within a population while others don't? And if you really look back at this example of the finches for a minute, let's assume that you are a finch in a population where most of the individuals have pretty tiny, sharp beaks. So we'll just pick this guy here. Oop. Okay, seriously. It won't let me draw in the picture. Okay, I'm going to use my cursor. This guy right here, he has sharp pointing little beak, most likely for picking up pretty small seeds, cracking small seeds. And let's assume that there's a lot of rain that year. And for some reason, most of the trees produce seeds that are much larger in size, maybe have tougher shells on them. Natural selection, we'll just go ahead and use that term now, and I'm going to define it for you in a minute. But the environment will not favor this type of beak in a situation where there aren't small seeds. Instead, if there are individuals within the population that maybe have bigger beaks that can crack the bigger seeds, those individuals would then be favored. The contrary is true. Let's say there was a dry year and the seeds were a lot smaller. Suddenly, this shaped beak is favored again. So it's the environment really that is determining which individuals have a survival advantage. So he noted this, and this is really critical. Some individuals have traits which make them better adapted to their environment. And we call these traits adaptations. And those individuals with these adaptive traits survive and reproduce more, passing on those adaptive traits to their offspring. So those individuals with adaptive traits not only do they survive, but they reproduce more than those who don't have the adaptive traits, and they pass these adaptive traits to their offspring. So we would guess that over time, the population is going to have more of those individuals with the adaptive traits. That is natural selection. The environment or nature is selecting which traits offer a survival advantage, and therefore those individuals survive and reproduce more, and over time more individuals within the population have those adaptive traits. So in the study of the finches, looking at how their beaks were adapted to their specific food type, but if that food type changed, then what might be an advantage at one point in time was now a disadvantage at another point in time. And so that's the other thing that he noted, is the environment changes. So which traits are the most common in a population changes over time. This change in frequency of certain traits within a population over time is what we call microevolution. And in order to really understand microevolution, it's important to have another set of key biological terms to go along with that. Let's start with this. Let's assume this is one of your chromosomes, all stretched out. Here's, let's say, chromosome number 5, just randomly. And that chromosome is a long double-stranded piece of DNA. So that's what your chromosome is this is DNA, which is your unit of heredity. And on that DNA, there's a region of DNA that codes for one trait or one protein. And let's call that region from here to here. That region of DNA that codes for one trait or one protein is called a gene. So your gene isn't your whole chromosome, and it's certainly not all of your DNA. You have about 25,000 genes, give or take, on your DNA. So a gene is a region of DNA that codes for one protein. And in this case today, in this story, we'll call that a trait. Let's say this is a gene that codes for fur color in rabbits. And let's say there are 2 different colors of fur that rabbits can have. Let's say that rabbits can have tan fur, or they could have gray fur. Those are 2 different versions of the same gene. So you can have one DNA recipe saying make tan fur, and you can have a different DNA recipe that says make gray fur. And those are both located in the same place on the DNA. So let's say this is the fur color gene. There are 2 different versions of that fur color gene. One that's going to give the bunnies tan fur, and one that's going to give them gray fur. So these are different versions of the same gene. And we call those alleles. Alleles are different versions of the same gene. That's an incredibly important term. You're going to hear that term over and over and over this semester. Gene and alleles are 2 very important terms. At any given time, the number of individuals with tan fur in the population and the number of individuals with gray fur in the population is going to change. There are going to be times when one is more common, and there are going to be times when another one is more common. We call that the frequency. The frequency of alleles within a population changes over time. And how that frequency changes, that is the study of microevolution. And there are several mechanisms by which microevolution occurs, only one of which is natural selection. Natural selection is when the environment determines that specific traits or specific alleles, oops, well, that's too many syllables on that word. In other words, specific versions of a gene offer a survival advantage, but more importantly, a reproductive advantage. So more individuals with those adaptive traits survive and reproduce, and over time, the population is going to have more of that allele. So if we're talking about rabbit fur, and somehow that tan fur offers a survival advantage, then you would expect that over time, more individuals in the population are going to have tan fur. I want to spend a little bit more time on this one than the others, because this is really one of the major ways that microevolution occurs. And there are great examples of it in humans, one of which is in the videos that you're going to watch this week. There is an important video that you're going to watch on lactose tolerance in humans. And I'll just go ahead and give you a sneak preview of that video. If you can digest milk as an adult without getting any gas pain or any other digestive issues, you have a gene mutation that allows that to occur. That is not the normal human genetic condition. And yet it's somewhat prevalent in humans, especially humans of Northern European origin and certain regions of Africa. If your ancestors are from either of those places, then you are likely able to digest milk as an adult. As adults, we don't need to be able to digest milk. We aren't using milk as our primary nutrition source anymore. All baby humans, all baby mammals need to be able to digest milk, but as adults, we don't need to be able to do that. So the normal human genetic condition is that you stop making the enzyme that breaks down lactose. Important to understand that lactose is a sugar. It's what's called a disaccharide, meaning it's two sugars together, that's made of glucose bonded to galactose. This is just one component of milk, by the way. So milk has protein and fat and other great things in it. This is the sugar that's in the milk. So lactose is milk sugar, and it's a disaccharide. This is too big to get into your cells. The only way it can get into your cells is if you have an enzyme that can break this bond through hydrolysis. You're going to learn about that this semester. That enzyme that can break that bond is lactase. If you still make enough lactase enzyme as an adult to be able to break that into sugar, simple sugar, into glucose and galactose, into monosaccharides, and get that into your cells, then you have a gene mutation. There was obviously a survival advantage at some point in human history to being able to make lactase as an adult. And those who were able to do that survived and reproduced more. And now a lot of people have this gene mutation. This would not have happened if humans weren't raising cows in particular as a food product for their milk, not for their meat, but for their milk. So when humans started domesticating cows and sheep and goats and using that milk as a food source, that offered what we call the selective pressure that caused this gene mutation to offer a survival advantage. So that's one really important video that you need to watch and take really great notes on, because I can guarantee an essay question about that great example of natural selection in humans. Another great example of natural selection in humans involves sickle cell disease and malaria. Malaria, is still one of the #1 killers on the globe in certain places in the world. If you live in a country that has malaria, this is one of the #1 causes of death. Millions of people still die from malaria. Malaria is caused by a protist. It's an amoeboid parasite that is carried in the saliva of certain mosquitoes and transmitted to humans, and it parasitizes normal red blood cells. Sickle cell disease, completely unrelated normally, except in this story, okay? In sickle cell disease, you have a gene mutation that causes one amino acid in your protein for hemoglobin to be incorrect, and that protein doesn't fold correctly. It doesn't have the right shape. You're going to learn a lot this semester about how that happens. But the end result is a red blood cell that is not shaped correctly. It is shaped roughly like this, rather than round. So this would be the sickled red blood cell. This would normally offer a huge disadvantage. Okay, so in the United States, different environment, we don't have malaria. If you have sickle cell disease, you have severely reduced ability to carry oxygen. This is a big disadvantage compared to the normal red blood cell. But if you live in a place with malaria, it actually offers a survival advantage, because this cannot infect a sickled red blood cell. The malaria parasite cannot infect your cells. So what normally would be a huge disadvantage in a different environment now becomes a survival advantage. And therefore, in areas with malaria, sickle cell disease is very common. In the United States, not so common. It doesn't offer a survival advantage. In fact, it offers a disadvantage. So that is another great example of natural selection in humans. One more quick example that we can relate to, and that is antibiotic resistance, specifically in bacteria. Antibiotics only treat bacteria, by the way. Antibiotics cannot treat viruses. Viruses are not living. If you'll think back to that first lecture about what makes something living, anti means against, biotic means living. If something's not living, you can't kill it with antibiotics, okay? Antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Let's say you have this population of bacteria. They're not intentionally different sizes. I'm just drawing them quickly. And this one has something in its DNA that's a little bit different. They're all treated with an antibiotic, and they're all killed, except for this one that has something about its DNA that's different. This is now the one that survives and reproduces. And over time, the whole population of bacteria is now going to have that slight difference in its DNA. And now they are all antibiotic resistant. So those individuals that had a trait that made them better adapted, not killed by the antibiotic, survived and reproduced. And now, rather than just having one in the population with that gene, the whole population looks that way. That is natural selection. There's one other important video that you're going to watch about the rock pocket mouse. And this is also an amazing example of natural selection. Be sure to take really good notes on that as well. So that's just one way that we can have a change in allele frequency within a population over time, is through natural selection. In this discussion of natural selection, I've used the term mutation a few times. A couple of things that are really important to note here before I even define mutation for you. Natural selection is not random. Random would mean that it wasn't moving in one direction or the other. In other words, it wasn't favoring one direction or over the other. It was just random which one survived. Natural selection is saying the opposite. It's saying the environment is determining that one trait is more advantageous than another. That's not random. So if one fur color offers a survival advantage over the other, that is moving in one specific direction. That is not random. What is random, though, this is where it gets a little confusing, is the mutation. Mutations are random. These are random changes in the DNA, which leads to new alleles. And this is, really the major way that new alleles arise is through mutation. The mutation itself is random. If there's a random change in the DNA of certain individuals in a population and that creates a new allele, that allele might not offer any advantage or disadvantage. Okay, it could be neutral. It could offer a disadvantage. Or it could offer an advantage, but it doesn't always offer an advantage. The key is the mutation is random. That's how we get new alleles, but those changes in our DNA don't always have any effect at all. In fact, most of the time they don't. And in some cases they offer a disadvantage, but when they do offer a survival advantage and those individuals survive and reproduce more, that's how we get new alleles. And you're going to see in that story of the rock pocket mouse a really key mutation that offered a survival advantage. If it hadn't, it probably just would have gone away. It wouldn't have become more common. But mutation is how new alleles arise in the population. But natural selection is not random. I shouldn't have circled those separately. I should have circled them together. Not random. Not random. Natural selection. But mutations are random. Other ways that microevolution can occur. Let's say that there are some insects and this specific population of insects, obviously all the same species living in the same place at the same time. And I'm going to have some brown individuals. Sorry, I'm trying to make it go away. And there are going to be some green individuals. And these are my insects. I'm not going to take the time to draw them out as insects. And let's say that there is a stream and a big mountain range, and it's really hard for these insects to get across, but over here is a population. It's all green, and maybe they have a couple of blues. And they've just been separated long enough that they haven't been breeding with each other, but they can. There's a big storm, and some individuals end up going over to this other population. So let's say that now some of these brown ones get blown over here. When those brown ones join the population, they're bringing new alleles into that population with them. So now we have brown ones And that's bringing new alleles into the population, not through mutation, but through migration. And that's called gene flow. So migration of individuals into a population either bringing new alleles or just changing the frequency of existing alleles. So gene flow has to do with migration of individuals. This next way that microevolution can occur, I don't really like the term because it's too similar to gene flow. I wish they'd call it something different. It's called genetic drift. And this is when there's some event that makes the population smaller. Could be a catastrophic event. And I'm just going to use the bottleneck effect as my only mechanism of genetic drift I'm going to talk about, because the other one gets a little more confusing, a little too connected to gene flow. So I like this one. It's called the bottleneck effect. It's also very relevant for a reason I'm going to tell you in a minute. Let's say we have this same population of insects and there is a flood that comes through and now a lot of the individuals are wiped out. And we did have 6 and 6 for the two different colors, but let's say that most of the green ones are wiped out and now what remains are the brown ones and the one green. And it was totally random. It had nothing to do with who could swim better or who could survive better. It just was a random. That new, smaller population will most likely not have the same allele frequencies. And in fact, we could lose some alleles. This is really, really important when we're looking at organisms whose numbers have been drastically reduced, especially due to human activities. So through habitat destruction, poisoning, hunting, other things we do on this planet to reduce the numbers of certain organisms down to critical levels. And now they don't have that genetic diversity, and some catastrophic event can now come along and completely cause the extinction. You need genetic diversity within a population of organisms so that there is enough difference there that when the environment does change, there's someone who can adapt. If everyone is genetically the same, then it could take just one change in the environment to wipe everyone out. A virus, a fungal infection, changes in temperature, and there's no one there who can adapt to those changes because everyone's genetically the same. So when we get to organisms on the endangered species list, those are at critical chance of extinction because that genetic diversity isn't there anymore. So bottleneck effect is when the population size is reduced and that new population doesn't represent the allele frequency of the original population. There are also ways that alleles can become more frequent in a population that are really interesting, such as sexual selection. Another term for sexual selection is non-random mating. And in this case, either the males or the females are selecting specific traits that they desire in a mate, and those are the individuals they're mating with. So those individuals are producing more offspring. In biology, biological fitness isn't whether you're the strongest or the fastest, it's the number of offspring you have during your lifetime is your biological fitness. And that's really the key to genetic success, is if you pass on your adaptive traits to more individuals in the population. So living longer doesn't matter if you don't have as many offspring. And a lot of times females will choose males or males will choose females who have specific traits that they favor. And those individuals with those favorable traits, as determined by the other gender, is going to determine which traits are passed on to the next generation. So if you had, for example, a bird species where some of the males had really, really big tail feathers and they were more susceptible to predation, but more of the ladybirds were mating with them. And so they ended up having more offspring, even if they die sooner because they're eaten by a predator, they have higher fitness because they had more offspring before they died. So sexual selection is really interesting. Also, artificial selection is what we do as humans, where we select for specific traits in our crops, in our pets, in our livestock. And we decide which individuals are going to reproduce. So for our crops, we find those plants that have those desirable traits, and those are the seeds we collect, and then those are the ones that we use to plant the next generation. So we are selecting artificially which traits are favorable rather than the environment deciding that. So let's recap the different mechanisms of microevolution. We'll call those microevolutionary mechanisms, ways that microevolution happens. And the first one was natural selection. Remember that natural selection is not random. The environment is dictating that one allele offers a survival advantage over another, and those individuals with the selective or advantageous traits are the ones that survive and reproduce more. So those with the traits best adapted to the environment survive and reproduce more. And over time, the population has more individuals with those adaptive alleles. Oops. This is what happens when I talk and write at the same time. So it's moving in one specific direction, and remember, there are all those important videos about that. We talked about gene flow, which was migration of individuals into a population and changing the allele frequency in that population as a result, maybe even bringing new alleles into the population. We talked about one mechanism of genetic drift called the bottleneck effect, in which a population size is drastically reduced and that new smaller population doesn't represent the allele frequency of the original population. And that can be really dangerous. We talked about sexual selection, when either males or females select for specific traits that might not make them live the longest, but so long as they're passing on more of those genes to their offspring, they have what's called higher biological fitness. We talked about artificial selection, in which humans select specific traits that they prefer, and they allow those individuals to reproduce. And as part of all of this, we talked about mutations, and that mutations are random changes in the DNA, and they don't always offer a survival advantage or disadvantage. Sometimes they're actually neutral. Macroevolution is what happens when new species arise. And we will talk about macroevolution in a separate lecture. So that is it today for microevolution.